Imagine, you wake in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The air is heavy with the musk of sweat and iron. In the darkness of a barracks that never sleeps, the clatter of boots strikes stone like a drumbeat of fate. Rows of men move in silence, their eyes sharp, their jaws set, their hands resting on weapons that glint in the torchlight. No laughter. No chatter. Only the echo of discipline. At first, you think you are witnessing just another army at drill. But you soon understand, this is no ordinary gathering of soldiers. This is a brotherhood forged in fire and fear, a corps of men feared by their enemies and mistrusted by the very rulers who created them. These are the Janissaries, the hidden blade of the Ottoman Empire. They were called Janissary, the new troops, but there was nothing new about the ancient, brutal idea that shaped them, loyalty stripped from childhood, devotion beaten into bone. To stand among them is to feel history's weight in your chest. Imagine the silence before dawn, when boys turned soldiers kneel together, heads bowed, swearing eternal service not to family, not to homeland, but to a man most had never seen, the Sultan, the Padishah, shadow of God on earth. Their oath was more binding than chains, more final than death. Once spoken, there was no turning back. Picture yourself standing at the edge of their barracks. The space is cavernous, walls blackened with soot, air alive with the tang of gunpowder. Long wooden beams rise like the ribs of a beast, and between them hang standards, flags painted with crescents, talismans of conquest. Along the floor lie weapons stacked with an almost religious precision, rows of muskets polished to dull silver, curved sabers whose edges catch the firelight. These weapons are not merely tools. They are extensions of the men themselves, reminders of battles fought and blood spilled across the empire's vast frontiers. If you close your eyes, you hear it, the crack of muskets echoing over the Hungarian plains, the roar of Janissary chants as they advance on Vienna's walls, the screams of enemies who believed themselves safe behind fortresses that crumbled under Ottoman might. The Janissaries were more than fighters. They were the hammer of the empire's ambition, striking with a rhythm that terrified kingdoms from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia. And yet, here is the strange truth. For all their power, the Janissaries were prisoners too. Their lives were not their own. They were taken, as boys, from villages far from Istanbul, seized from Christian families who wept as their sons vanished into the maw of empire. What you see before you is not an army of volunteers. It is an army of captives transformed, reshaped until they no longer remembered the faces of their mothers, the names whispered to them in infancy. They were remade into weapons. Imagine being one of them. A child, no more than 8, perhaps 10. You are led away by strange men in embroidered robes, the sound of your mother's wailing fading behind you like the toll of a bell. You are marched with others, your feet blistering on roads that wind toward Istanbul. You do not understand the language spoken around you. The world feels vast and foreign, and yet you are told this is now your home. You will never again see your village. You will never again hear your father's voice. What is taken from you is not only your body but your very past. From this day forward, you belong to the Sultan. This is the foundation upon which the Janissaries were built, a core born of loss, hardened by discipline, bound by oaths stronger than blood. Their origins were soaked in sorrow, but their rise was unmatched. Within decades of their creation, they had become the most feared soldiers of Europe. Enemies called them demons in human form. Allies spoke of them with a mix of awe and dread. Even the Ottoman sultans, masters of a vast empire, eyed their Janissaries with unease, knowing that this brotherhood's loyalty, though absolute in word, was a blade that could turn inward. The firelight flickers across their faces. They are not uniform in appearance. Some carry the pale skin and blue eyes of Balkan villages, others the darker features of Anatolia. But all are clothed the same, tall felt hats with flaps trailing down their backs, long coats belted at the waist, boots polished but scarred. Their eyes, though, are the same, cold, distant, trained to mask whatever human softness once lived behind them. You realize, as you watch them move, that this corps is not just a military unit. It is a secret order, a society unto itself, walled off from the world outside. Within these barracks, there is no family but the Brotherhood, no father but the Sultan, no God but the one they have been given. And yet, the silence hums with something darker. For beneath the discipline, beneath the order, lies a truth that unsettles even the most hardened Ottoman vizier. These men, shaped to obey without question, wield power that can topple kings. Imagine being the Sultan himself, seated in Topkapi Palace, knowing that outside your gilded halls, thousands of Janissaries march, train, and watch. They have made sultans. They have unmade them. Their cheers can carry a ruler to triumph. Their revolt can end his reign in blood. This is why they were feared. This is why they were whispered about in the coffee houses of Istanbul and the palaces of Europe alike. The Janissaries were the empire's strength and its shadow, a force that could never be fully controlled. They were the Sultan's sword, yes, but sometimes a sword slips its master's grip. Step deeper into their world now. Feel the press of the barracks walls around you, hear the muttered prayers in the dark, the rustle of cloth as soldiers kneel on reed mats. Smell the acrid smoke of the torches. These men are not like the farmers who filled European levies, nor the mercenaries who sold their swords to the highest bidder. These men have been unmade and remade, sculpted into instruments of war. Their lives are stripped of softness, their hours filled with drill, ritual, and silence. To live as a Janissary is to live as a shadow, half man, half weapon, waiting for the command that will unleash you upon the world. The Empire hides many secrets in its heart, but none darker, none more extraordinary than this corps. As the torches flicker and the chant of the evening prayer fades into silence, you understand, the Janissaries are not simply soldiers. They are a warning. They are what happens when loyalty is twisted into chains, when discipline becomes a prison, when the might of an empire is concentrated into a single, unblinking brotherhood. And the story of their rise, and their fall, is only beginning. The silence of the barracks lingers, but behind it stretches a path into the past, into the strange ritual that birthed these men. For to understand the Janissaries, you must follow the trail back to the villages where they were taken, to the nights when Ottoman officials rode into Christian lands with ledgers and sharp eyes. It is here, in the dust of Balkan roads, that the story begins, not with steel and fire, but with children. Imagine it. A winter morning in a small village clinging to the side of the mountains in Macedonia, or perhaps deep in the valleys of Bosnia. Snow still lies heavy on the roofs, smoke curling faintly from chimneys. A bell tolls in the local church, its sound echoing through the frosted air. Families stir from their beds, pulling rough wool around their shoulders. They do not yet know that today, the Empire has come for them. Down the road, a troop of mounted officials advances. They are not an army in the traditional sense. There are no banners flying, no drums beating. But their presence carries the same weight. They wear long robes trimmed with fur, turbans wrapped tight against the cold, swords glinting at their sides. Some carry scrolls and ink. They are scribes as much as soldiers, record-keepers of an empire that measured its strength in flesh as much as land. This is the devshirme, the levy of boys, the blood tax. The villagers know the drill. They have seen it before, perhaps in their father's time. They gather in the square, mothers clutching children, fathers stiff and silent. The air grows tense, the smell of wood smoke mingling with fear. The officials dismount. They begin to move through the crowd, their eyes sharp, hands pointing. They are not looking for volunteers. They are selecting. Imagine being one of those boys. You are perhaps 8, perhaps 10. You have your father's eyes, your mother's hands. You have helped herd goats, fetched water, played in the dust with your cousins. You are just a child. And now you feel the grip of a stranger's hand on your shoulder, pulling you forward into the open. You see your mother fall to her knees, clutching at your arm, begging. You see your father's jaw tighten, His fists curl helplessly at his sides. The official shakes his head. The boy is chosen. The family must let go. What makes it worse is the ritual calm of it all. This is not a raid, not a sack, not the brutality of Mongol hordes storming into villages with fire and steel. This is colder, more methodical. Names are written down. Faces are memorized. Boys are sorted like livestock at a market. Some are dismissed as too young, too frail, too small. Others are taken. There is no appeal. No bargaining. No choice. The devshirme was, in its own cruel way, a masterpiece of imperial control. The Ottomans did not simply conquer land. They harvested people. Christian families under Ottoman rule, Greeks, Albanians, Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, were required to surrender their sons at intervals determined by the empire's needs. The boys were then marched away, never to return, raised to serve as Janissaries or court officials. They would be converted, trained, and stripped of their old identities until nothing remained but service to the Sultan. The empire called it duty. The families called it theft. Pause here. Think of the sound in that village square. Mothers wailing, fathers cursing under their breath, children screaming as they are dragged away. Horses snort, officials bark commands, scribes scratch ink onto parchment. Snow crunches beneath boots. And then silence. The troop mounts up again, the chosen boys gathered like a flock of lambs for slaughter. The families are left behind in the square, broken, diminished, staring at the road as it carries their sons away. Some collapse into despair. Others retreat into bitter resignation. For all know the truth, those boys are gone forever. Now picture the road itself. Days of marching, the boys stumbling along with swollen feet, their eyes red from crying. At first, they look back, straining for a glimpse of home, but soon the villages vanish behind hills and forests. Ahead lies only Istanbul, the city of the Sultan, the mouth of the empire that swallows them whole. But here is the paradox. As cruel as it was, the devshirme offered something extraordinary in its own twisted logic. For while the boys were stolen, they were also elevated. A peasant's son, destined to live and die unknown in a forgotten valley, could now rise to become a Janissary commander, even a vizier, wielding power that shook the world. The path was paved with tears, but at its end lay glory. And the empire knew this. It was part of the bargain, silent but understood: sacrifice your child, and he may one day stand closer to the Sultan than any noble born of Ottoman blood. The Ottomans justified it as service to God and empire. The boys were to be replanted, their wild roots pulled up and set in new soil, trained to grow straight, loyal, and unbending. Christian by birth, they would be Muslim by destiny. Villagers saw only cruelty, but the empire saw raw material, waiting to be forged into steel. Step closer now. Imagine you are one of those boys, herded into a makeshift camp on the road to the capital. You sit with dozens of others, a thin blanket around your shoulders, the stars cold above you. Around the fire, the officials talk in a language you only half understand. You catch words: Allah, Sultan, Hizmet, service. You clutch your knees, rocking slightly. The boy beside you whispers his mother's name, again and again, until he falls asleep. You do not sleep. The world has tilted. You no longer know who you are. And yet, even in this terror, the transformation has already begun. For tomorrow, you will march again, and the day after that. Slowly, the sound of your mother's voice will fade. The memory of your village will grow dim. You will walk into Istanbul as one thing and emerge as another. The devshirme was not merely recruitment. It was ritual erasure. Names were changed. Languages were forbidden. The boys were baptized a second time, not with holy water, but with silence, with discipline, with prayer recited in a tongue not their own. The Ottomans were not raising mercenaries. They were creating something far stranger, an army of men with no past, no family, no ties but the empire itself. And what a machine it created! Consider how Europe viewed them. When Janissaries appeared on the battlefield, their enemies often faltered before the first musket fired. To fight them was to fight men who had no home but war, no loyalty but the Sultan, no fear of betrayal because there was nothing left to betray. They were the empire's purest weapon, and their origin in the devshirme was what gave them that purity. But the cost was unbearable. Entire generations of villages hollowed out, bloodlines broken, families mourning sons who vanished like smoke. Some mothers, desperate, scarred their children with burns or cut tendons in secret, hoping to make them undesirable to the officials. Some fathers hid their boys in the forests when the levy approached. But the empire was thorough. Few escaped. Even centuries later, the echo of it lingers in Balkan memory. Old songs whisper of children taken, of mothers keening, of fathers cursing the crescent moon. The Ottomans may have called it a levy, a duty, but to those who lived beneath it, it was a wound that never healed. And yet, step back, breathe. The empire thrived because of it. The Janissaries rose from this soil of sorrow to become the spine of Ottoman might. Without the devshirme, there would have been no empire as the world knew it. No conquest stretching into Hungary, no walls of Vienna trembling beneath cannon fire. The blood tax carved out the empire's strength, and for centuries, the Ottomans paid for victory with the tears of their subjects. Picture again that barracks where we began. The faces of the Janissaries stare back at you, their eyes cold, their hands steady on their weapons. Each one of them was once a boy in a village square, chosen by a stranger's hand. Each one was once a child torn from his family. And yet here they stand, transformed into the empire's most disciplined warriors. The silence of the barracks now carries a different weight. It is not only the silence of soldiers at rest. It is the silence of thousands of lost names, thousands of broken ties. Beneath the polished muskets and gleaming sabers lies the memory of weeping mothers, of fathers left standing in the snow. Every janissary is a monument to absence, every drill a ritual of forgetting. And so, as you watch them move, you understand that the devshirme was not simply a levy of boys. It was the empire's darkest alchemy, grief transmuted into power, sorrow into steel. The road lengthens. The boys, gathered in their silent clusters, march with uneven steps. The smell of dust and leather, the clop of hooves, the rasp of crying that fades into hiccups and then into silence. This is the rhythm of the levy. But as the empire pulls them farther from the villages, something heavier than exhaustion settles over them. It is the ache of absence. They have been torn from family. And though the empire calls it service, what the boys feel is grief raw enough to burn. You can almost hear it in the stillness of the night camps. A boy curls into his knees, whispering a lullaby his mother once sang. Another holds tight to a pebble from his village, clenched in his fist until his palm is raw. Some refuse to eat, staring blankly at the bread pressed into their hands. Others cry until sleep takes them. They do not yet know the full shape of what has happened, but they know something is missing, something that cannot be returned. Think of the parents left behind. The silence after the levy departs is almost worse than the taking itself. The square empties, the smoke thins, and the mothers sit before their hearths with eyes fixed on the door that will never open again. Fathers drink heavily, muttering curses at the empire under their breath, knowing that to speak too loud is to invite punishment. Sisters sleep in beds that feel too large without the brother who once shared them. Families fracture not only in body but in spirit. Some cling to faint hope. Rumors pass from village to village. Perhaps the boys will be educated. Perhaps they will live as princes in Istanbul. Perhaps one day they will return in glory. But most know better. Return is forbidden. The very design of the devshirme ensures it. The boys are forbidden to write home, forbidden to speak their mother tongue, forbidden to remember. To be chosen is to be erased. Pause for a moment. Imagine yourself as one of those boys, 9 years old, pulled from the warmth of a mother's arms. Your father's calloused hand tried to hold you back, but the officials pried you free. You shouted until your throat burned, but your words vanished into the cold wind. Now you walk with strangers. Each step carries you farther from the people who gave you life, and the memory of their faces already begins to blur. Will you remember the sound of your mother's laugh? The way your father's voice rumbled in the evenings? Or will the empire's discipline scrub it clean? That was the genius, and the cruelty, of the system. The Ottomans understood that loyalty divided is loyalty weakened. A soldier who remembers his family might think of desertion. A soldier who longs for his village might hesitate on the battlefield. But a soldier who has no past, who has been cut clean from the soil of his birth, can be remade into something unbreakable. To tear the boys from family was not a byproduct. It was the very foundation of the Janissary machine. And so the boys were marched farther, deeper into the empire, until even the mountains and rivers of their homelands no longer framed the horizon. The terrain changed. The language around them shifted. By the time they glimpsed the domes and minarets of Istanbul, they were already adrift, their roots severed. They were no longer sons of villages. They were clay in the hands of the Sultan. But the wound of separation never fully healed. Beneath the uniforms, beneath the discipline, beneath the chants and the prayers, each janissary carried the ghost of a family left behind. Some buried it so deep that it never surfaced. Others felt it rise in dreams, in the rare moments of quiet, in the sudden pang at the sound of a foreign lullaby sung by a passing nursemaid. Grief was the secret companion of the Janissary corps, invisible but ever present, shaping men who had been made by absence as much as by training. The empire, of course, masked it with ritual. Upon arrival in Istanbul, the boys were divided, some sent to farms in Anatolia to learn the language, to harden their bodies, to forget their childhoods. Others were taken directly into palace schools. Wherever they went, the rules were clear: no letters home, no visits, no mention of the past. To speak of family was to risk punishment. To cling to memory was to invite pain. And so they learned silence. But silence is not emptiness. Imagine sitting in a dormitory at night, the oil lamps guttering, the scent of straw and sweat thick in the air. Around you, rows of boys shift on their mats. Some sleep, others whisper prayers in new tongues. You lie awake, staring at the beams above, trying desperately to recall your mother's face. But the image blurs. You remember her hands perhaps, the feel of her fingers smoothing your hair. But her voice? Already it slips from you. And in that moment you understand, the empire is winning. For the Janissary oath, taken years later when the boys became men, was only possible because of this earlier rupture. Only by tearing them from family could the Sultan bind them so completely to himself. Only by emptying their hearts of one loyalty could he fill them with another. The core was not built on love of empire. It was built on the absence of anything else to love. And yet, irony laced through the design. Though the boys were forbidden to remember, the memory of their taking lived on in the lands they had left. Whole villages kept scars. Songs told of the levy. Folk tales grew around the children who vanished, some casting them as martyrs, others as traitors. In the Balkans, mothers sang lullabies that warned children to stay close, lest the empire steal them in the night. Even centuries later, these stories linger, the devshirme echoing in the cultural memory like a bell that will not stop tolling. The Janissaries themselves sometimes heard those echoes when they marched into battle on European soil. Imagine standing in formation, musket in hand, looking across a battlefield and seeing peasants who looked like your cousins, spoke a language once your own, prayed in churches that smelled of your childhood. The empire demanded you fight them without hesitation. And you did. But somewhere deep, behind the drilled obedience, something twisted. You were both the sword and the wound. This paradox haunted the core. It made them fierce, yes, fierce because they had nowhere else to belong. But it also made them dangerous. For men who have been torn from family carry within them both loyalty and rage. They can be the most obedient soldiers, but also the most volatile rebels. The empire gambled that loyalty would win. For centuries it did. But the cost was always simmering beneath. So now, as you stand again in that barracks, watching the Janissaries polish their muskets, you see them differently. Not just as soldiers, but as orphans of design, men raised in absence, sharpened by grief. Every musket drilled, every prayer whispered, every march through the streets of Istanbul carries within it the echo of families left behind. The corps is not only a force of war. It is a monument to separation. And this is the heart of it. The Janissaries were strong not because they had families, but because they had lost them. The silence after grief does not last long. The empire never allowed emptiness to linger. Into the hollowed hearts of those boys it poured discipline, as relentless and cold as the iron chains of a galley. Once torn from family, they were not permitted to drift. They were seized, molded, and hammered into shape like swords in the forge. Imagine the first mornings in their new life. The boys wake before dawn, not to the gentle call of a mother's voice or the soft rattle of a church bell in a distant village, but to the bark of an overseer, a whip-striking stone, a command that slices through sleep like a blade. They rise from mats on the floor, bones stiff, mouths dry. No murmuring, no hesitation. Those who lag feel the sting of correction. Order begins before the sun itself. The day unfolds with mechanical rhythm. Bodies march in line, step after step across courtyards slick with dew. The air smells of sweat and oiled wood. Commands echo, repeated until they become reflex. Lift the musket. Shoulder it. Present. Fire. Again. Again. Until arms shake and shoulders bruise, until the motion is carved into the body like script into stone. Discipline is not only movement, it is silence. In the barracks, laughter fades. Conversations thin to murmurs, always cautious, always brief. The boys learn to keep their thoughts folded tight inside their skulls. Obedience is measured not only by how swiftly they march, but by how little they speak. A slip of the tongue, a word of complaint, and punishment falls swift. A week of extra drills, a ration cut in half, the sting of a rod across the back. Food itself becomes part of discipline. Meals are plain, timed, measured. Thick stews of lentils, hard bread that cracks teeth, water ladled into clay cups. No feasts, no indulgences, no lingering at the table. To eat is not pleasure, but fuel. They eat in silence, bowls lifted and lowered together, the clatter of spoons striking wood like a drumbeat. They rise as one. They leave as one. In time, they even begin to hunger as one, their bodies conditioned to the rhythm of the corps. Discipline seeps into posture, into voice, into thought. A Janissary does not slouch. A Janissary does not shout in anger. A Janissary obeys without hesitation, even if the order seems impossible. They are taught that hesitation itself is a betrayal, that questioning is weakness, that the Sultans will move faster than thought. And so the boys practice obedience until it becomes instinct. Imagine standing among them as they kneel in lines, hands clasped, foreheads pressed to the ground. The air hums with whispered prayers, not in the tongue of their birth but in the words of the empire, words drilled into them until they replace old memories. Each prayer is both devotion and drill, each bow of the head another nail hammered into the coffin of their old lives. Their training is not only of the body but of the mind. The boys are taught to read, not the books of their childhood faith, but the scripts of the empire, Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, Persian. They copy lines until their hands cramp, the letters looping and curling like chains. Knowledge itself is rationed, controlled, made part of obedience. They learn enough to serve, enough to command when ordered, but never enough to wander. And yet, there is something monastic in it all. The barracks echo with the austerity of a monastery. Beds are aligned in rows, blankets folded with precision, boots set neatly at the foot. Each boy is bound by ritual, by oaths, by silence. Their life is one of denial: no wine, no women, no property, no distraction. They live like monks, but their prayers end not in salvation, but in the sharpening of swords. The body is hardened in other ways. Drills stretch into hours under the burning sun or in the biting cold. They run until their lungs heave, lift weights until their arms shake, practice swordplay until their palms bleed. They sleep sore, wake sore, march sore. The pain is constant, but pain itself becomes a teacher. Pain teaches endurance. Pain teaches silence. Pain teaches that a Janissary belongs not to himself, but to discipline. Some break. There are whispers of boys who collapse, who weep, who beg to be sent home. Their punishment is swift, not only to them but to those who watch. The Corps makes examples, reminding every boy that weakness is not permitted. Better to be broken early than to infect the whole. And so the survivors learn: do not weep, do not falter, do not remember. But others thrive. Some boys, taken young enough, begin to forget they were ever anything else. The barracks becomes home. The overseer becomes father. The Corps becomes family. They begin to take pride in the rhythm, in the sharp crack of muskets fired in perfect unison, in the gleam of polished armor, in the way their steps echo as one. In losing their families, they gain a brotherhood, bound not by blood but by discipline. Imagine walking into the courtyard as the boys drill. The sun strikes polished helmets, rows of muskets glint in unison, boots strike stone in rhythm so perfect it feels like thunder. The overseer watches, silent, a faint smile tugging at his lips. In this moment, you see what the Empire saw: not a line of boys, but a wall of soldiers, unbreakable, identical, terrifying in their order. And this was the secret of their strength. While European armies were often filled with mercenaries who fought for coin, or peasants conscripted in desperation, the Janissaries were something else entirely. They were a corps trained from childhood, bound by discipline tighter than family, taught to march, fight, and even think as one. They were a machine, forged not in metal but in flesh. The discipline seeped into symbols too. The Janissaries carried their own standards, not only flags but sacred objects, great kettles, symbols of the Corps, around which they gathered in ritual. To eat from the same kettle was to swear brotherhood. To march beneath it was to march as one body. Even rebellion, when it came centuries later, would be signaled by turning those kettles upside down. Discipline was not just an action. It was in the very symbols they lived by. But perhaps the most chilling part of their training was the oath. When the time came, each boy, now grown into a young man hardened by years of drills and silence, would kneel and swear absolute loyalty to the Sultan. The words were simple but final. To break them was to invite death. To keep them was to erase oneself. The oath sealed what the training had begun. The boy was gone, and in his place stood a Janissary. And so you see how the Empire turned absence into power. Torn from family, the boys were emptied. Through discipline, they were filled again, but filled not with love or freedom, only with obedience. They became soldiers whose very identity was discipline, whose very breath was obedience. Stand in that courtyard, the echo of boots still in your ears, and you will understand why kingdoms trembled at the sight of them. For an army of men bound by coin can be bribed, and an army of peasants bound by land can be broken. But an army bound by nothing but discipline, an army with no home but the Corps, no family but the Sultan, that is an army that cannot be unmade. The courtyard drills fade into dusk. The boys, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, file back into the barracks. But the Empire's work on them does not end with the body. Night belongs to the mind, and the mind, too, must be conquered. Imagine the flicker of oil lamps in a long hall, shadows stretched across stone walls. The boys kneel on reed mats, their foreheads pressed low. Around them stand teachers, Hajas, men of learning draped in long robes, their beards thick, their voices deep and steady. They chant words in Arabic, verses pulled from a book the boys have never seen before their capture, words foreign yet insistent. The sound fills the hall like water seeping into cracks. Slowly, endlessly, it reshapes everything it touches. This is the next stage, religious re-education. The Ottomans knew that a soldier who remembered another god, another scripture, another name whispered over his cradle, would always carry within him the seed of rebellion. So the old faith had to be not just set aside but uprooted entirely. The Janissaries were not simply trained to fight, they were remade to believe. The first lesson was silence. The boys were forbidden from speaking the prayers of their childhood, forbidden from crossing themselves, forbidden even from whispering the names of saints, or Christ or the Virgin that once filled their world. If caught, punishment was swift, a beating, a day without food, humiliation before the others. Faith itself became dangerous, something hidden, something beaten down until it no longer dared to rise. In its place came new rituals. At dawn, the call to prayer echoed across Istanbul, spilling into the barracks like a command. The boys learned to wash hands and faces, feet and mouths, water cold against their skin. They learned to bow, to press their foreheads to the ground in rhythm with hundreds of others. At first they stumbled, their bodies awkward, their tongues clumsy with the foreign words. But repetition is a cruel tutor. In time, their movements became smooth, their voices strong, their memory of old prayers buried beneath the endless weight of the new. Think of what it felt like. A boy who once sat in a church lit by candles, staring up at painted saints, now bows toward a city he does not understand, repeating words that do not belong to him. His heart aches for the familiar, but the ache is drowned in the sea of voices around him. To resist is to stand alone. To submit is to vanish into the crowd. Most chose submission, for resistance meant pain. And yet, the empire was clever. It did not only force faith, it also gave. The boys were taught that in Islam, all Janissaries were brothers, equal under God. No matter their village, no matter their birth, they were one. This promise of equality was intoxicating, especially for boys taken from poverty, from lives where their families bent beneath landlords and priests. Here, within the barracks, they were not peasants' sons. They were the chosen of the Sultan, bound together by a faith that erased difference. Education extended beyond prayer. They learned the stories of prophets, the sayings of Muhammad, the laws of Sharia. They copied them onto parchment until their hands ached, the ink smudging on their fingers. Each verse they memorized, each phrase they repeated, carved the old world deeper into shadow. Soon, when they thought of heaven, it was no longer the heaven of their birth. When they thought of God, it was no longer the God whispered in their villages. The empire had planted a new root, and it grew quickly in the soil of youth. But the most haunting transformation was in their names. The overseers stripped them away. A boy who entered as Nikola left as Ali. A boy who once answered to Stefan was now Mehmet. Names that mothers cried in village squares were erased from the record, replaced with names that tied the boys forever to their new faith. The loss of a name is no small thing. It is the burial of the self. And yet the boys had no choice. They answered to the new names, and in time, they began to forget the old. This was not only conversion, it was replacement. Old loyalties, old gods, old languages were buried beneath the weight of endless ritual. Slowly, the boys ceased to think of themselves as captives. They became believers, sincerely, deeply, some even zealously. The empire's genius lay here, to turn theft into devotion, to make the stolen child kneel willingly, to make him call the Sultan not just master but protector of the faith. Of course, not all accepted it so easily. There were whispers of boys who clung secretly to their old faith, who traced the cross on their chests at night under the blankets, who whispered forbidden prayers into the straw of their mats. But secrecy is a fragile thing in a barracks where dozens live shoulder to shoulder. Some were caught. Some betrayed each other, eager for approval. Others carried the secret silently all their lives, fighting battles within their souls even as they fought wars for the Sultan. You can almost see it, the flicker of inner conflict in the eyes of a young Janissary kneeling in prayer. Outwardly, he bows like the rest, his lips moving in rhythm with the verses. Inwardly, a memory stirs, the smell of incense in a stone church, the faint chant of a priest in a tongue long forbidden. Two faiths clash in his heart. But the body obeys the stronger master, and the stronger master is the one that feeds him, clothes him, punishes him, owns him. Slowly, inevitably, the inner fire fades. The empire did not rely only on fear. It relied on belonging. Religious re-education was not just about stripping away. It was about weaving a new tapestry, one in which the boys were no longer outsiders but insiders. As Janissaries, they were told they were the guardians of the faith itself, the protectors of Islam, the chosen soldiers of God's shadow on earth. For a boy who once had nothing, this promise was intoxicating. It gave purpose where there had been only loss. And so the process, cruel as it was, succeeded. Within a few years, the boys who once wept for their families now knelt eagerly at dawn prayers. Their tongues recited verses with fluency. Their names were Muslim names, their festivals Muslim festivals, their identities fully recast. The grief remained buried deep, but above it grew a fierce new faith, one that bound them to the core as tightly as discipline itself. Step into that barracks once more. The lamps flicker low, casting golden halos on bowed heads. The air smells of wax and sweat. Dozens of voices rise in unison, chanting words they once stumbled over but now know by heart. They are no longer children of villages. They are no longer Nicola or Stefan. They are Ali, Mehmet, Suleiman, sons of the Sultan, guardians of the faith, shadows forged in the empire's image. And here lies the true terror of their transformation. They were not simply conquered. They were remade until they believed they had never been anything else. The prayers fade into silence, the lamps gutter low, and the boys, now molded into young soldiers of faith and discipline, wake to a new sound. Not the bark of overseers this time, nor the soft murmur of scripture, but the sharp crack of gunpowder igniting. The courtyard fills with smoke, the air heavy with the bitter tang of sulfur. Muskets rise and fall in perfect rhythm. The Janissaries are not only men of silence and prayer, they are masters of war. Imagine standing on the edge of a battlefield in the 15th century. The ground trembles beneath the tramp of boots, the metallic clatter of armor, the neigh of horses. Across the field, European knights sit atop their chargers, lances poised, banners flapping in the wind. To them, war is still a matter of chivalry, of steel against steel, of noble charges meant to break the enemy in one thunderous clash. They know swords, they know arrows, they know the thunder of hooves. But they do not yet know what is about to descend upon them. The Janissaries advance, not in scattered ranks, not in chaotic rushes, but as a wall. Muskets lift in unison, barrels gleaming. The air holds its breath. And then, with a roar, the first volley erupts. Smoke clouds the field, a storm of lead tears into the charging knights, horses collapsing mid-stride, men toppling beneath the weight of armor. Before the echoes fade, the Janissaries have already reloaded, their hands moving in practiced rhythm, powder and ball packed, muskets raised once more. Another volley cracks the sky. Then another. The knights never reach them. This is their secret, order in chaos. While other armies relied on brute force, the Janissaries relied on precision, discipline carried into the very heart of battle. They were among the first in Europe to use firearms not as novelty but as strategy, to turn gunpowder into an extension of their discipline. The musket was not merely a weapon in their hands, it was a ritual, as carefully drilled as a prayer. And yet, they were not only gunners. Each Janissary carried a curved saber, its edge honed to a gleam, its sweep designed for close combat. In the smoke of the battlefield, When lines clashed and musket volleys gave way to chaos, they moved like blades of the same sword, cutting through the enemy with terrifying precision. Their training had taught them to fight not as individuals but as extensions of one another, each movement complementing the next, each strike part of a larger rhythm. Picture it. The charge of armored knights shatters against their wall, the smoke clears, and suddenly the Janissaries surge forward. Sabers flash, muskets swing as clubs, knives glint in hands that know no hesitation. To face one was to face them all. To fight against them was to fight against the very concept of order itself. But their secret lay not only in weapons. It lay in fear. For the Janissaries were not merely soldiers, they were a symbol. When word spread that Janissaries marched, entire villages surrendered before the first shot was fired. Castles lowered their banners, knowing resistance would bring only fire and blood. The mere sight of their white felt hats, the plume rising tall, was enough to break courage. They carried with them not just muskets and sabers, but the reputation of invincibility. At Nicopolis, at Varna, at Constantinople, they proved again and again that no wall was too high, no knight too strong, no army too large. They were the hammer of the Sultan, and wherever they fell, the world cracked. Even their formation was terrifying in its simplicity. While European armies struggled with mercenaries who might flee at the first sign of danger, the Janissaries held their ground. They advanced in silence, muskets raised, drums pounding a steady rhythm that shook the air. The sound alone unnerved enemies. The low, relentless thunder of the Janissary Mater band, kettledrums, horns, cymbals, blasting across the field like the voice of doom. It was music not meant to inspire beauty, but terror. Imagine it, the earth quaking with drums, the shriek of horns piercing smoke, the steady tramp of boots. To hear it was to know death was marching. And then there was the matter of the kettles. Strange to outsiders, sacred to the core, these great cauldrons were carried into battle as symbols of unity. Around them, men ate, prayed, and rallied. To lose a kettle was disgrace, to protect it was honor. Even in rebellion, centuries later, the Janissaries would signal defiance by overturning them. On the battlefield, the kettles served as anchors of discipline, around which the corps reformed, no matter how fierce the fight. Their warfare was not simply a matter of guns and swords, it was ritual. Every volley timed, every advance measured, every retreat calculated. The discipline drilled into them in the barracks spilled onto the battlefield until the two became indistinguishable. War itself was an extension of their training, as orderly and inexorable as prayer. And yet they adapted. When cannons thundered at the walls of Constantinople in 1453, it was the Janissaries who surged through the breaches, sabers cutting, muskets firing point blank. When sieges dragged on for months, they endured, their discipline unbroken. When ambushes struck, they reformed in lines before the dust had settled. They were not a static force bound to one style of war, they were a living machine, shifting with each new weapon, each new challenge, always returning to the same core: unity, precision, fear. Imagine yourself among them. Smoke thickens until you cannot see 10 paces ahead. Your ears ring with the roar of muskets, the crash of drums, the screams of dying men. Your hands move without thought: powder, ball, ramrod, raise, fire. Again. Again. Around you, your brothers do the same, their movements as steady as your own. Fear has no place here. The corps has drilled it out of you. In this chaos, you are not one man. You are part of a wall, a machine, a shadow. This was the secret that made them unassailable for centuries. The ability to turn individuals into extensions of one another, to make war itself into a kind of prayer. Enemies saw chaos. The Janissaries saw rhythm. Enemies saw death. The Janissaries saw duty. And when the field was won, when the enemy broke and fled, when the smoke cleared and the silence returned, the Janissaries marched back to their barracks with the same cold discipline. No songs of victory, no drunken celebration, no boastful tales. Victory was expected, as natural as breath. They returned to their kettles, their prayers, their silence. War was not glory. War was ritual. And so, as you stand in the barracks once more, the weapons stacked neatly against the walls, the muskets gleaming, the sabers honed to perfection, you understand, their secret was not simply in steel or powder. It was in the fusion of discipline, faith, and fear into a single weapon. The Janissaries did not fight battles. They embodied them. The battlefield fades. The muskets are stacked once more in the barracks, the drums fall silent, the kettles simmer with the smell of lentils and lamb. But beneath the rhythm of discipline and the roar of war lies the thread that bound the Janissaries more tightly than any chain, their loyalty to the Sultan. It was a loyalty unlike any other, one that began in childhood and grew into something both unshakable and deeply unsettling. Imagine kneeling among them on the day of oath-taking. The courtyard is filled with young men, their heads bowed, their hands pressed to the hilts of their sabers. Before them stands not the Sultan himself. Rarely would he lower himself to appear in person, but a representative, a vizier, a voice of the throne. The words spoken are simple, yet each syllable weighs more than iron. They swear eternal obedience to the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, the Caliph of Islam. Their loyalty is not to father or mother, not to brother or village, not even to empire in the abstract. It is to one man, one figure, distant yet absolute. The ritual is heavy with symbolism. The oath is taken not with hand on holy book but with hand on sword and head bowed toward the Sultan's seat. To disobey is not only treason but blasphemy. The Janissary becomes a vessel of the Sultan's will, his identity absorbed into the throne's shadow. Imagine what it felt like to speak those words, to let them burn into your throat until they became part of you. For many, the oath was not a choice. It was survival. But over time, survival hardened into devotion, and devotion into pride. And yet the bond was strange. Most Janissaries would never lay eyes on the Sultan except from afar. When he appeared in public processions or festivals, a glittering figure framed by silks and jewels. To the common soldier, the Sultan was more myth than man, a presence felt in the weight of commands, in the gold coins of pay, in the fear of punishment. Loyalty to the Sultan was not loyalty to a person. It was loyalty to an idea, the empire embodied in flesh. This loyalty was reinforced at every level. Pay came directly from the Sultan's treasury. Promotions were granted in his name. Victories were celebrated as his victories, defeats endured as his burdens. Even meals tied the Janissaries to him. The food in their kettles, the bread in their bowls, all were said to come from the Sultan's generosity. To rebel against him was to bite the hand that fed them, to shatter the covenant of sustenance. The Janissaries' barracks were built within reach of the palace itself, a constant reminder that they were not only the empire's soldiers but its guardians. By day, they drilled in the courtyards. By night, they stood watch over the city, their presence a silent wall between the Sultan and the chaos of the streets. For centuries, the Janissaries were not only his army abroad but his shield at home. No rebellion could reach the throne without first facing them. But here is the paradox. The Sultan feared them as much as he relied on them. For absolute loyalty, once given, creates absolute power. And power, as the empire would discover, does not always remain obedient. Picture it, the Janissaries marching through Istanbul, their boots striking stone, their kettles gleaming, their flags unfurled. Citizens bow as they pass, shopkeepers close shutters, children fall silent. The corps moves not as soldiers but as a presence larger than life, a reminder that the Sultan's reach is everywhere. And yet, within that march, within that silence, lies an unspoken truth: the Sultan rules, but it is the Janissaries who keep his rule alive. Without them, his throne is just a seat of wood. With them, it is a fortress. Loyalty became a ritual even in war. On the battlefield, when Janissaries advanced, they did so not in their own name but in his. Their cries were not for themselves but for the Padishah. When they planted their standards on conquered soil, it was as if the Sultan himself had extended his hand. They did not see themselves as mere men. They were his shadows, his sword, his breath. And yet shadows grow long. The same loyalty that made them unbreakable soldiers also made them arbiters of power. For if the Sultan was the axis of their oath, what happened when the axis faltered? When a Sultan grew weak, indecisive, cruel? The Janissaries, sworn to protect him, sometimes decided protection meant replacement. It was they who stormed palaces, who deposed rulers, who raised new ones upon the throne. Their loyalty was absolute, but absolute loyalty demands a Sultan worthy of it. When he was not, they did not hesitate to act. This is the double edge of their oath. To the Sultan, they were his shield. To themselves, they were the guardians of the empire's very soul. If he faltered, they believed they had the right to strike in God's name, to keep the shadow pure. And so, sultans trembled before the very men sworn to protect them. Imagine being one of those rulers, sitting in the gilded chambers of Topkapi Palace, hearing the distant drums of the Janissary barracks. You know they are loyal, sworn to you, fed by you, armed by you. But you also know that if tomorrow they overturn their kettles, if they march toward your palace, there would be little to stop them. The loyalty you rely on is also the knife at your throat. And so the relationship between Sultan and Janissary became one of mutual fear wrapped in ritual devotion. The Sultan showered them with gold, with privileges, with symbols of honor. The Janissaries bowed, swore oaths, marched in silence at his command. Both sides pretended the bond was simple. Both knew it was not. Loyalty to the Sultan was, at its heart, a performance. A sacred theater enacted in barracks and palaces, in courtyards and battlefields, in the silence of oaths and the roar of muskets. And like all theater, it carried the danger that one day the actors might step out of their roles. And yet, for centuries it held. For centuries, the Janissaries fought and bled for sultans whose faces they barely knew, protected a throne that feared them, and embodied a loyalty that was as terrifying as it was absolute. They carried with them not just muskets and sabers, but the reputation of invincibility. At Nicopolis, at Varna, at Constantinople, they proved again and again that no wall was too high, no knight too strong, no army too large. They were the hammer of the Sultan, and wherever they fell, the world cracked. Even their formation was terrifying in its simplicity. While European armies struggled with mercenaries who might flee at the first sign of danger, the Janissaries held their ground. They advanced in silence, muskets raised, drums pounding a steady rhythm that shook the air. The sound alone unnerved enemies. The low, relentless thunder of the Janissary Mater band, kettledrums, horns, cymbals, blasting across the field like the voice of doom. It was music not meant to inspire beauty, but terror. Imagine it, the earth quaking with drums, the shriek of horns piercing smoke, the steady tramp of boots. To hear it was to know death was marching. And then there was the matter of the kettles. Strange to outsiders, sacred to the core, these great cauldrons were carried into battle as symbols of unity. Around them, men ate, prayed, and rallied. To lose a kettle was disgrace, to protect it was honor. Even in rebellion, centuries later, the Janissaries would signal defiance by overturning them. On the battlefield, the kettles served as anchors of discipline, around which the corps reformed, no matter how fierce the fight. Their warfare was not simply a matter of guns and swords, it was ritual. Every volley timed, every advance measured, every retreat calculated. The discipline drilled into them in the barracks spilled onto the battlefield until the two became indistinguishable. War itself was an extension of their training, as orderly and inexorable as prayer. And yet they adapted. When cannons thundered at the walls of Constantinople in 1453, it was the Janissaries who surged through the breaches, sabers cutting, muskets firing point blank. When sieges dragged on for months, they endured, their discipline unbroken. When ambushes struck, they reformed in lines before the dust had settled. They were not a static force bound to one style of war. They were a living machine, shifting with each new weapon, each new challenge, always returning to the same core: unity, precision, fear. Imagine yourself among them. Smoke thickens until you cannot see 10 paces ahead. Your ears ring with the roar of muskets, the crash of drums, the screams of dying men. Your hands move without thought: powder, ball, ramrod, raise, fire. Again. Again. Around you, your brothers do the same, their movements as steady as your own. Fear has no place here. The Corps has drilled it out of you. In this chaos, you are not one man. You are part of a wall, a machine, a shadow. This was the secret that made them unassailable for centuries. The ability to turn individuals into extensions of one another, to make war itself into a kind of prayer. Enemies saw chaos. The Janissaries saw rhythm. Enemies saw death. The Janissaries saw duty. And when the field was won, when the enemy broke and fled, when the smoke cleared and the silence returned, the Janissaries marched back to their barracks with the same cold discipline. No songs of victory, no drunken celebration, no boastful tales. Victory was expected, as natural as breath. They returned to their kettles, their prayers, their silence. War was not glory. War was ritual. And so, as you stand in the barracks once more, the weapons stacked neatly against the walls, the muskets gleaming, the sabers honed to perfection, you understand, their secret was not simply in steel or powder. It was in the fusion of discipline, faith, and fear into a single weapon. The Janissaries did not fight battles. They embodied them. Boots still echo on the stone, muskets rest in their racks, but the Janissaries' story does not end at the barracks gates. Step with them into the streets of Istanbul, and you will see another side of their world. For centuries they had lived like monks of war, celibate, austere, loyal only to the Sultan and to discipline. Yet empires shift. Power bends the rules it once forged. And little by little, the Janissaries began to discover that they were not merely soldiers, but something far larger, a class unto themselves, a force with privileges carved into the very bones of Ottoman life. Imagine following a Janissary out of the barracks and into the bustling bazaar. The smell of roasted lamb and coffee drifts through the air, traders cry their wares in a dozen tongues, silks flutter, coins clink. Among the crowd, a Janissary moves easily, unchallenged. He carries no papers, no permits. He owes no taxes on goods he buys, no tolls at city gates. The fez on his head, the insignia on his coat, are passes more powerful than any writ. Guards step aside, shopkeepers bow, apprentices hurry to clear his path. His very presence is a badge of privilege. At first, these privileges were designed to ensure loyalty. Exemptions from taxation, stipends paid directly from the Sultan's treasury, the right to live in certain quarters of the city free of rent, these were meant to bind the Janissaries to the throne. But over time, they transformed the Corps into a privileged elite, envied by peasants, resented by merchants, feared by nobles. The Janissary was not just a soldier. He was a man above the ordinary rules. And with privilege comes appetite. Slowly, they reached beyond the barracks. Some opened shops in the markets, lending their names to businesses that thrived under the protection of their exemption from taxes. Others became landlords, owning property across Istanbul, collecting rents from those who once cowered before them on the battlefield. What had begun as a corps of disciplined warriors now stretched into the fabric of urban life. Picture a Janissary coffee house, dimly lit, thick with smoke, alive with murmurs. At the center sits a group of soldiers, their white felt caps tilted back, cups of bitter black coffee steaming before them. Around them gather artisans, merchants, poets, even clerics, eager to curry favor or hear news. Stories of campaigns are retold in low voices, but so too are rumors of politics, whispers of court intrigue, the rise and fall of viziers. The Janissaries drink, laugh, and listen, their very presence shaping the tone of conversation. These coffee houses became more than places of leisure. They were political salons, nerve centers of influence, where decisions that could topple governments were seated between sips. Their power was not confined to the capital. Across the empire, in provincial cities from Belgrade to Cairo, Janissaries set down roots. They took wives despite the old bans, raised families despite the rules, wove themselves into the fabric of local life. In some towns, the word Janissary ceased to mean soldier at all and became synonymous with authority itself, a man untouchable, a man whose anger could ruin you, whose friendship could protect you. The corps began to resemble not just an army but a guild, a brotherhood of privilege. They had their own internal economy, their own hierarchy of favors and debts, their own courts of judgment. Disputes between Janissaries could be settled without reference to local officials. To strike a Janissary in anger was to invite the wrath of the corps itself. Even governors hesitated, for to provoke them was to risk revolt. Step again into the bazaar. Watch as a merchant reluctantly lowers his price when a Janissary eyes his cloth. Watch as a baker, caught cheating on his weights, is dragged not to the city magistrate but before a circle of Janissary elders, who decide his punishment swiftly and without appeal. Their privileges gave them authority, and authority gave them the confidence to wield it openly. For the Sultan, this was both a gift and a curse. On one hand, their privileges tied them ever more tightly to the empire's core. They benefited from stability, from the wealth that flowed into Istanbul, from the taxes collected on others' shoulders. On the other hand, privilege bred independence. A corps that once looked only to the palace now had roots in markets, in families, in politics. Their loyalty, once absolute, began to mingle with self-interest. But still, they were courted. Sultans showered them with gifts, robes of honor, purses of gold, land grants. When a new ruler took the throne, one of his first duties was to distribute donatives to the Janissaries, a ceremonial payment that bought their recognition of his authority. Without it, the throne itself was precarious. Imagine the tension in those moments. The Sultan waiting in his palace as chests of gold were carried to the barracks, the soldiers gathered, their silence heavy, their acceptance or refusal hanging over the fate of a dynasty. The Janissaries knew their worth. They knew that the empire's armies were strongest with them, that the Sultan's palace was safest under their watch. And they knew that their privileges, once granted, could not easily be withdrawn. Any attempt to strip them risked rebellion. More than once, viziers who sought to curb their power found themselves dragged into the street, torn apart by the very men they had tried to discipline. Their privileges grew until they became a class apart. They dressed distinctively, spoke with authority, demanded respect in every interaction. Their children inherited their power, despite the original system forbidding it. Families boasted of Janissary blood, using it as currency in marriage alliances, in business partnerships, in politics. The corps had become not only a military brotherhood but a hereditary aristocracy of its own. Yet there was a darker side to this privilege. The same soldiers who once lived in austere silence now lingered in taverns, traded goods, lent money at interest. Some abandoned their drills, their muskets gathering dust while they pursued profit. Discipline waned as privilege waxed. And beneath the veneer of brotherhood, corruption seeped in. Bribes, favoritism, manipulation of rank, all became common. The corps was still feared, still honored, but the old iron of its discipline was softening. And so, as you walk once more through Istanbul, you see them differently. The Janissary at the market stall, haggling over silk, is not only a soldier but a businessman. The Janissary sipping coffee, trading rumors, is not only a fighter but a politician. The Janissary landlord counting rent is not only a servant of the Sultan but a master of common men. Their privileges have lifted them above ordinary life, and their power seeps into every corner of the empire. What began as a corps of stolen boys has become an elite class. They are envied, resented, feared, courted. Their power is both the empire's strength and its creeping weakness. For when a soldier begins to think more of his property than his musket, when his loyalty is divided between his sultan and his own wealth, what happens to the bond that once made him unbreakable? The question lingers like smoke in the air. For now, their privileges glitter, their power grows, their influence spreads across markets, families, and palaces alike. The empire still needs them. But beneath the wealth and honor lies a shadow of change, the discipline that once defined them slowly eroding, the loyalty once pure beginning to bend. And still, they march, their boots striking stone, their kettles gleaming, their presence filling the empire with both awe and unease. They carried with them not just muskets and sabers, but the reputation of invincibility. At Nicopolis, at Varna, at Constantinople, they proved again and again that no wall was too high, no knight too strong, no army too large. They were the hammer of the Sultan, and wherever they fell, the world cracked. Even their formation was terrifying in its simplicity. While European armies struggled with mercenaries who might flee at the first sign of danger, the Janissaries held their ground. They advanced in silence, muskets raised, drums pounding a steady rhythm that shook the air. The sound alone unnerved enemies. The low, relentless thunder of the Janissary Mater band, kettledrums, horns, cymbals, blasting across the field like the voice of doom. It was music not meant to inspire beauty, but terror. Imagine it, the earth quaking with drums, the shriek of horns piercing smoke, the steady tramp of boots. To hear it was to know death was marching. And then there was the matter of the kettles. Strange to outsiders, sacred to the core, these great cauldrons were carried into battle as symbols of unity. Around them, men ate, prayed, and rallied. To lose a kettle was disgrace, to protect it was honor. Even in rebellion, centuries later, the Janissaries would signal defiance by overturning them. On the battlefield, the kettles served as anchors of discipline, around which the corps reformed, no matter how fierce the fight. Their warfare was not simply a matter of guns and swords, it was ritual. Every volley timed, every advance measured, every retreat calculated. The discipline drilled into them in the barracks spilled onto the battlefield until the two became indistinguishable. War itself was an extension of their training, as orderly and inexorable as prayer. And yet they adapted. When cannons thundered at the walls of Constantinople in 1453, it was the Janissaries who surged through the breaches, sabers cutting, muskets firing point blank. When sieges dragged on for months, they endured, their discipline unbroken. When ambushes struck, they reformed in lines before the dust had settled. They were not a static force bound to one style of war, they were a living machine, shifting with each new weapon, each new challenge, always returning to the same core: unity, precision, fear. Imagine yourself among them. Smoke thickens until you cannot see 10 paces ahead. Your ears ring with the roar of muskets, the crash of drums, the screams of dying men. Your hands move without thought: powder, ball, ramrod, raise, fire. Again. Again. Around you, your brothers do the same, their movements as steady as your own. Fear has no place here. The Corps has drilled it out of you. In this chaos, you are not one man. You are part of a wall, a machine, a shadow. This was the secret that made them unassailable for centuries. The ability to turn individuals into extensions of one another, to make war itself into a kind of prayer. Enemies saw chaos. The Janissaries saw rhythm. Enemies saw death. The Janissaries saw duty. And when the field was won, when the enemy broke and fled, when the smoke cleared and the silence returned, the Janissaries marched back to their barracks with the same cold discipline. No songs of victory, no drunken celebration, no boastful tales. Victory was expected, as natural as breath. They returned to their kettles, their prayers, their silence. War was not glory. War was ritual. And so, as you stand in the barracks once more, the weapons stacked neatly against the walls, the muskets gleaming, the sabers honed to perfection. You understand, their secret was not simply in steel or powder. It was in the fusion of discipline, faith, and fear into a single weapon. The Janissaries did not fight battles. They embodied them. Walk again into their barracks. The courtyard is silent now, the muskets stacked, the drills ended, the market noise fading beyond the walls. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of smoke and stew, the flicker of lamplight casting shadows across rows of faces. Here, away from the gaze of viziers and merchants, away even from the Sultan's imagined presence, the Janissaries belonged to each other. The outside world saw them as a wall of silence, a machine of discipline, a class of privilege. But inside the barracks, among their own, another truth revealed itself. The core was a brotherhood, one bound not by bloodlines, which had been severed, but by rituals, oaths, and secrets that created a family stronger than kin. Imagine the great kettles, the heart of their world. Not just cooking pots, but sacred symbols. Around them they gathered for meals, each man dipping his spoon into the same stew, each mouthful an unspoken reminder, you are not alone, you are part of us. To eat from the kettle was to belong, to refuse was to break the bond. Even rebellion was marked by them. When discontent boiled over, Janissaries overturned the kettles in the courtyards, a silent declaration that the bond with the Sultan was broken, that their brotherhood now stood alone. Meals themselves were ritual. Silence fell as bowls were passed, as hands lifted food in unison. The youngest served the elders first, respect woven into the act. Bread was torn and shared, never hoarded. To steal from the table was unthinkable. To insult the food was to insult the core. The kettle was more than iron and fire. It was the axis of their fraternity, the hearth of men who had no other home. But brotherhood was not built only on food. It was carved into the rhythms of daily life. They rose together, marched together, prayed together, slept shoulder to shoulder in long dormitories where privacy dissolved into shared breath and whispered dreams. Every ache of drill, every bruise of punishment, every pang of hunger was endured in common. Suffering shared is suffering softened, and over time it transformed into a bond unshakable. There were rituals for everything. New recruits, once broken of their names and their pasts, were adopted by older Janissaries, mentors who taught them not only how to fire a musket but how to carry themselves, how to belong. These mentors were not fathers, nor exactly brothers, but something in between, shadows who guided the new boys into the fold, who watched their backs, who scolded and protected in equal measure. Bonds formed that lasted decades, forged not by blood but by need. Secrecy bound them as tightly as loyalty. Within the core, there were sayings, songs, gestures known only to them. Outsiders might hear fragments, murmured phrases in the coffee houses, strange salutes exchanged in markets, but their full meaning remained hidden. The Janissaries lived behind a curtain of ritual, one that excluded the world and bound them inward. To belong was to know the secrets. To know the secrets was to be part of the brotherhood. Imagine a night in the barracks, the oil lamps dimmed, the city's noise muted by stone walls. In the corner, a small group huddles, a drum beating softly, voices rising in a chant. It is not military drill, nor the formal prayer of the mosque, but something older, songs of the core, half legend, half warning, their words passed from generation to generation. Some tell of battles won, of brothers fallen, of kettles overturned. Others carry hints of mysticism, whispers of Sufi orders that once mingled with the Janissaries in their earliest days. For it was said that the core had roots not only in war but in faith, that they carried with them the blessings of dervishes, that their brotherhood was sanctified not just by blood spilled but by spirit shared. This mystical thread ran deep. In the early centuries, the Janissaries were closely tied to the Bektashi order, a Sufi brotherhood known for its secret rituals, its tolerance, its blending of mysticism with discipline. The Bektashis offered prayers for the core, blessed their banners, sanctified their kettles. In return, the Janissaries adopted their customs, cryptic sayings, shared meals, symbolic gestures. To outsiders, it looked like superstition. To the Janissaries, it was proof that their brotherhood was not only earthly but spiritual. They were not just soldiers of the Sultan, they were guardians blessed by God's friends. This fusion of war and mysticism deepened their sense of belonging. Imagine being a young recruit, stripped of family, drilled to obedience, bent beneath the weight of loss. Then, in the quiet of night, you kneel with your brothers, candles flickering, a dervish's voice weaving prayers that speak of unity, of brotherhood, of God's favor upon you. For the first time, you feel not only erased but remade, not a stolen boy, but part of something sacred. And so the bond grew thicker than blood. Blood ties could be broken by distance, by death, by betrayal. But the Janissary brotherhood was chosen, or rather, imposed and then embraced. Within it, betrayal was unthinkable, for to betray a brother was to betray yourself. Punishments for disloyalty were harsh, swift, and often final. A man who stole from his comrades, who betrayed their secrets, who abandoned them in battle, could find himself beaten to death not by order of a sultan, but by the very men who had once shared his kettle. The corps policed itself, kept itself pure, for its survival depended on the strength of its bond. Brotherhood extended even into death. Fallen Janissaries were mourned not by families, those ties long severed, but by their comrades. Funerals were simple but heavy with ritual. Brothers carried the body, washed it, wrapped it in cloth, whispered prayers over it. In the silence of those ceremonies, the absence of mothers, fathers, wives was stark. Yet the brotherhood filled the void. The corps was family to the end. Step closer to their daily life, and you will see how the brotherhood shaped even small things. A man injured in drill would not be left behind but carried by his comrades. A soldier without coin would find his meal covered by others. Disputes were settled internally, but once settled, they were buried. No lingering grudges, no fractures allowed to fester. Unity was survival. Disunity was death. But like all families, the brotherhood was not without rivalry. Seniority mattered. Elders commanded respect, juniors bore the weight of chores and menial tasks. Friendships blossomed, but so too did jealousies, resentments, grudges. Yet the corps had ways of containing these, through ritual, through shared meals, through the ever-present reminder that no matter your quarrel, you were brothers first. And there was joy, too. Imagine the barracks alive on festival nights, drums pounding, voices singing, food shared in abundance, cups raised in unison. Stories told of battles survived, of comrades lost and remembered, of narrow escapes and victories won. Laughter echoed against stone, rough and loud, breaking the silence of discipline. For in these moments the Janissaries were not shadows of the Sultan. They were men, brothers who had suffered and endured together, who found in each other what the empire had denied them, belonging. This, more than muskets, more than privilege, more than fear, was the secret of their endurance. The Janissaries were not simply a corps of soldiers bound by orders. They were a brotherhood that replaced the families torn from them, that gave them identity when the empire had stripped it away. But like all bonds, this brotherhood could twist. The same unity that made them unbreakable in battle made them terrifying in rebellion. When kettles overturned, when drums beat not for the Sultan but against him, the brotherhood moved as one. The streets of Istanbul shook beneath their boots, and no vizier, no palace guard, no sultan himself could withstand the storm of their unity. And so, as you stand once more in the barracks, listening to the low murmur of voices, the laughter shared over kettles, the prayers whispered in secret, you understand. The Janissaries were never alone. They were never merely soldiers. They were brothers, in discipline, in faith, in privilege, in rebellion. The corps was not just an army. It was a family remade by fire, and within that family lay both the empire's greatest strength and its most dangerous threat. They carried with them not just muskets and sabers, but the reputation of invincibility. At Nicopolis, at Varna, at Constantinople, they proved again and again that no wall was too high, no knight too strong, no army too large. They were the hammer of the Sultan, and wherever they fell, the world cracked. Even their formation was terrifying in its simplicity. While European armies struggled with mercenaries who might flee at the first sign of danger, the Janissaries held their ground. They advanced in silence, muskets raised, drums pounding a steady rhythm that shook the air. The sound alone unnerved enemies. The low, relentless thunder of the Janissary Mater band, kettledrums, horns, cymbals, blasting across the field like the voice of doom. It was music not meant to inspire beauty, but terror. Imagine it, the earth quaking with drums, the shriek of horns piercing smoke, the steady tramp of boots. To hear it was to know death was marching. And then there was the matter of the kettles. Strange to outsiders, sacred to the core, these great cauldrons were carried into battle as symbols of unity. Around them, men ate, prayed, and rallied. To lose a kettle was disgrace, to protect it was honor. Even in rebellion, centuries later, the Janissaries would signal defiance by overturning them. On the battlefield, the kettles served as anchors of discipline, around which the corps reformed, no matter how fierce the fight. Their warfare was not simply a matter of guns and swords, it was ritual. Every volley timed, every advance measured, every retreat calculated. The discipline drilled into them in the barracks spilled onto the battlefield until the two became indistinguishable. War itself was an extension of their training, as orderly and inexorable as prayer. And yet they adapted. When cannons thundered at the walls of Constantinople in 1453, it was the Janissaries who surged through the breaches, sabers cutting, muskets firing point-blank. When sieges dragged on for months, they endured, their discipline unbroken. When ambushes struck, they reformed in lines before the dust had settled. They were not a static force bound to one style of war, they were a living machine, shifting with each new weapon, each new challenge, always returning to the same core: unity, precision, fear. Imagine yourself among them. Smoke thickens until you cannot see 10 paces ahead. Your ears ring with the roar of muskets, the crash of drums, the screams of dying men. Your hands move without thought: powder, ball, ramrod, raise, fire. Again. Again. Around you, your brothers do the same, their movements as steady as your own. Fear has no place here. The Corps has drilled it out of you. In this chaos, you are not one man. You are part of a wall, a machine, a shadow. This was the secret that made them unassailable for centuries. The ability to turn individuals into extensions of one another, to make war itself into a kind of prayer. Enemies saw chaos. The Janissaries saw rhythm. Enemies saw death. The Janissaries saw duty. And when the field was won, when the enemy broke and fled, when the smoke cleared and the silence returned, the Janissaries marched back to their barracks with the same cold discipline. No songs of victory, no drunken celebration, no boastful tales. Victory was expected, as natural as breath. They returned to their kettles, their prayers, their silence. War was not glory. War was ritual. And so, as you stand in the barracks once more, the weapons stacked neatly against the walls, the muskets gleaming, the sabers honed to perfection, you understand, their secret was not simply in steel or powder. It was in the fusion of discipline, faith, and fear into a single weapon. The Janissaries did not fight battles. They embodied them. The laughter around the kettles fades, the festival drums grow quiet, and in the silence another truth surfaces. The Janissaries were forbidden from the most ordinary of human ties. No wives. No children. No households of their own. For centuries, the rule was absolute. A Janissary belonged to the Sultan, to the Corps, and to no one else. Imagine it. You are a young man, your body hardened by years of drill, your tongue fluent in the prayers of Islam, your identity long since remade. You fight, you march, you eat with your brothers. But when night falls and the city quiets, when the streets echo with the sounds of families, mothers singing lullabies, fathers returning from shops, children tumbling into laughter, you remain in the barracks, surrounded only by men. The empire has denied you a wife, denied you children, denied you the chance to plant roots beyond its walls. The reasoning was simple, ruthless. A married soldier has loyalties beyond his commander. A father thinks not only of the battlefield but of the bread his children will eat tomorrow. The Janissaries could not afford such division. To ensure their devotion, their entire existence had to be contained within the core. To forbid marriage was to forbid distraction, to forbid the dilution of loyalty. And so, the barracks became their home not only in training and discipline but in the very shape of their lives. They slept in rows, not in houses. They shared meals, not with wives, but with brothers. They raised no children, leaving the core itself to provide continuity. Their family was the kettle, their heritage the oath, their lineage the core itself. It was, in many ways, a monastic existence. Like monks, they lived in celibacy, bound by vows. Like monks, they gave their lives to a higher power, forsaking worldly ties. And like monks, they found in their brotherhood a surrogate family to fill the absence. Yet this was no monastery of peace. Their prayers ended in powder and blood. Their silence was broken by muskets. Their devotion was not to God alone but to a throne. The band shaped every aspect of their culture. It deepened the bonds of brotherhood, for with no wives to confide in, no children to love, their comrades became all they had. Secrets were shared in whispers over kettles, sorrows drowned in the camaraderie of smoke-filled coffee houses. Affection, rivalry, loyalty, all played out within the core. But absence carves its own scars. Imagine the loneliness of old age in the barracks. Your body stiff, your hair gray, your hands scarred by decades of steel. You have no children to bring you food, no wife to tend your illness, no family to sit beside your bed. When you die, your brothers will bury you. They will whisper prayers, tip your body into earth. And then life will go on, the kettles will boil, the muskets will fire, and you will vanish as though you never lived. To be a Janissary was to know that you left no legacy but the core itself. Some men accepted this with pride. To die leaving nothing but the memory of battles fought, the shadow of loyalty, the echo of oaths, this was enough. Others struggled. Whispers spread of men who snuck into the city at night, meeting women in secret, taking lovers despite the ban. Punishments for discovery were harsh, yet desire is older than law. The barracks could not fully erase the human hunger for intimacy. Still, for centuries, the rule held. It was enforced not only by overseers but by the Brotherhood itself, for to marry was to betray the core, to place another bond above the kettle. Men who defied the ban risked not only punishment from superiors but ostracism from their comrades. In the tight-knit world of the Janissaries, to be cast out was a fate worse than death. The ban was not only about discipline, it was about control. By denying marriage, the empire ensured that Janissaries left no children to inherit their position. The core was replenished only by the devshirme, the levy of boys torn from Christian villages. Each generation was a new harvest, cut off from the roots of the last. In this way, the Sultan kept them pure, loyal not to bloodlines, but to him alone. And yet, as centuries passed, cracks appeared. The core grew powerful, wealthy, independent. Their privileges multiplied, their influence seeped into markets and politics. And with power came defiance. Slowly, quietly, the old rule began to erode. Some Janissaries married in secret, hiding wives and children in the city. Others made their liaisons open, daring authorities to punish men too powerful to touch. By the 17th century, the ban was little more than memory. The core had transformed. Where once they were celibate soldiers bound only to the Sultan, now they were husbands, fathers, merchants, landlords. Families sprouted in the very quarters where once no woman had been allowed. Children grew up calling Janissaries father, inheriting their privileges, swelling the core with bloodlines once forbidden. The Brotherhood was no longer a family only by choice, it became a family in truth. But the erosion of the band carried a price. For as soon as the Janissaries planted roots beyond the core, their loyalties began to divide. No longer could they think only of the Sultan's orders. They thought also of their wives, their children, their shops, their homes. The old iron of discipline softened, replaced by the weight of property and kinship. The corps that had once lived as monks of war became a sprawling class, half soldiers, half citizens. This change was a slow decay, one that sultans watched with growing unease. For the ban on marriage had been the keystone of Janissary discipline. Without it, their brotherhood was still strong, but its purity was gone. What had once made them unbreakable now made them unreliable. They still marched, still fought, still swore oaths. But behind their oaths stood wives whispering in their ears, children clinging to their legs, businesses demanding attention. And so, when you walk the streets of Istanbul in these later centuries, you see a different kind of janissary. Not only the soldier in gleaming uniform, but the father haggling in the market, the husband sipping coffee beside his wife, the landlord collecting rent. The old ban has faded, but its ghost lingers, a reminder of what once made them so feared, so unyielding. The story of the ban on marriage is the story of transformation, of how the corps moved from austere shadows bound only to the Sultan, to men entangled in the very world they had once stood apart from. It is the story of discipline eroded by desire, of rules broken by the pull of ordinary life, of loyalty diluted by love. And yet, perhaps it is also a story of humanity breaking through iron. For the empire sought to strip them of all bonds, to make them weapons without hearts. But the human need for connection, for intimacy, for family, proved stronger than any decree. Even the most disciplined army cannot extinguish the hunger to love and be loved. The barracks that once felt like a monastery now breathe with another rhythm. Where once silence ruled, now laughter and chatter spill into the courtyards. Where once discipline demanded austerity, now comforts creep in. The Janissaries are still feared, still privileged, still wrapped in the aura of their brotherhood, but the sharp edges of their old life are blunting. It begins with small cracks. A man lingers too long in the market, tending a shop rather than a musket. Another slips away at night, not to pray or drill, but to visit his wife and children in a house tucked discreetly behind the bazaar. A third lends money to a merchant, collecting interest that lines his purse with more profit than soldiers' pay. The overseers know, the viziers whisper, even the Sultan hears, but punishment no longer comes swiftly. For the corps has grown too large, too powerful, too essential. To strike at them risks rebellion. And so the cracks widen. Imagine a morning drill in the 17th century. The line forms, muskets raised, commands shouted. But some arrive late, their boots dusty from errands, their hands smelling of spice or bread rather than gunpowder. Others stumble through the motions, their arms softened by months of neglect. The overseer scolds, but his voice carries less weight than it once did. For behind every soldier stands not just the corps but a family, a business, a network of influence. Punishment can no longer be meted out without consequence. What was once forbidden becomes normal. Janissaries marry openly, their wives and children known in the city. They build houses, invest in shops, inherit property. They take apprentices not for muskets but for looms, for forges, for ledgers. The corps begins to look less like a barracks and more like a guild, a fraternity of craftsmen and merchants who happen also to carry muskets. Coffee houses become their second barracks. Step inside one on a smoky evening, the air thick with tobacco, the clatter of dice on wood, the hum of conversation. Janissaries sit at the center, their presence magnetic, their voices shaping the stories of the city. Politics is whispered here, viziers are mocked, sultans are judged. The coffee house becomes a parliament of shadows, where the rules of empire are weighed not by scholars or nobles but by soldiers who were once forbidden to speak outside their ranks. The corps begins to bend rules even in war. Campaigns that once filled them with pride now inspire grumbling. Marching to distant lands is no longer embraced as sacred duty but resented as disruption to their shops, their homes, their families. Some bribe officers to remain in the city rather than join the army on campaign. Others go, but half-heartedly, their discipline slackened, their unity frayed by distractions of the world. On the battlefield, the once terrifying wall of muskets sometimes falters, volleys poorly timed, lines unsteady. Enemies notice. Fear gives way to defiance. The secret of their warfare, once their pride, begins to slip. And yet, even as they break the rules, they cling to their privileges. They still demand donatives from new sultans, still expect gifts, still march in processions with heads high. They are no longer monks of war, but they are still untouchable. Anyone who dares question their conduct faces the wrath of a corps that can overturn kettles and shake palaces. The Janissaries live in a paradox, breaking the laws that made them strong, while wielding the strength those laws once gave them to resist correction. Consider the Sultan's perspective. He sits in his palace, surrounded by gold and silks, but beyond the walls, the Janissaries whisper and drink, trade and gamble, defy the very rules he relies on to keep them loyal. To discipline them risks mutiny. To ignore them risks decay. He watches as the course slips from his grasp, yet he cannot act. The sword that once defended him now wavers in his hand. For the Janissaries themselves, breaking the rules does not feel like betrayal. It feels like evolution. Why should they not marry, when they are men like any other? Why should they not trade, when their presence opens doors and fills purses? Why should they march to distant wars when the empire itself is bleeding wealth and power, while their families need them at home? They convince themselves they are still loyal, still brothers, still soldiers of the Sultan. They do not see that each broken rule chips away at the foundation of their strength. But the cracks are visible to all. Foreign envoys write home of Janissaries more interested in coffee than combat, of soldiers seen haggling in bazaars rather than drilling in courtyards. Merchants grumble at their dominance of guilds. Ordinary citizens whisper that the once feared warriors are now little more than bullies in uniform. The legend of invincibility begins to rot. And yet, the Brotherhood remains. Inside the barracks, the kettles still simmer, the prayers still rise, the bonds still hold. They are not what they once were, but they are still Janissaries. Still feared. Still dangerous. Still capable, when angered, of turning their unity into revolt. Their rule-breaking does not make them weak in the eyes of the Sultan. It makes them unpredictable. And unpredictability is more dangerous than weakness. Imagine again the coffee house at night. A Janissary leans back, smoke curling from his pipe, his saber resting against the wall. Around him, merchants and poets, clerics and beggars, all listening as he speaks. His words are slow, deliberate, tinged with amusement. He mocks a vizier's policies, hints that the Sultan has grown soft, suggests that the corps deserves more pay. The listeners nod, laugh, murmur approval. In this moment, he is not merely a soldier. He is a kingmaker, a voice louder than the throne. This is what breaking the rules has wrought, a corps that no longer obeys its boundaries but defines its own. And so, the empire drifts into danger. For an army that breaks its own rules is an army that cannot be relied upon. Yet an army with the Janissaries' power cannot be disbanded, cannot be ignored. They are both the empire's shield and its sickness. They break the rules, but no one dares stop them. The story of their decay begins here, in the laughter of coffee houses, in the clink of coins in bazaars, in the quiet defiance of men who once bowed in silence and now bend rules to their will. The Janissaries remain, but the iron of their discipline is gone, replaced by something softer, something more human, and in its softness lies the seed of their downfall. The barracks no longer feel like a monastery, no longer echo only with the sound of drills and prayers. They have become something else, part school of politics, part theater of whispers, part den of plots. Once, the Janissaries obeyed orders without hesitation, but now their tongues are as sharp as their sabers, and their influence flows as easily as the Bosporus tide. Where rules are broken, conspiracies are born. Imagine the palace at night. Behind its gilded gates, the Sultan reclines on cushions, courtiers hovering at his side. But even here, beyond the latticed windows and perfumed halls, he cannot escape the Janissaries' presence. Their barracks lie close, their drums rumble in the dark, their whispers ripple through the coffee houses. He knows they are speaking of him, weighing him, deciding whether he is strong enough to keep their loyalty. A ruler of the empire must not only command battles, he must survive the judgment of his own army. For the Janissaries had discovered their true power. They were not merely guardians of the throne. They were its arbiters. Picture a vizier rising in the divan, proposing reforms, perhaps stricter discipline, perhaps reductions in pay, perhaps new levies to fund campaigns. Word of his plans reaches the barracks. Within days, coffee houses hum with anger. Whispers turn into mutters, mutters into threats. Then, one morning, the kettles are overturned, the barracks erupt, and the vizier is dragged into the street. His reforms die with him, his body trampled by the very men who once swore obedience. This was no rare occurrence. More than one grand vizier learned that his true judges were not scholars or jurists, but the soldiers who drank coffee in smoky corners. And the sultans themselves were not safe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Janissaries played kingmakers, enthroning and deposing rulers with terrifying ease. When a sultan proved unpopular, too weak, too stingy with donatives, too eager to impose discipline, the Janissaries turned their fury on him. Picture it: the barracks gates burst open, drums thunder, soldiers pour into the palace grounds. Guards scatter before them. The Sultan, once untouchable, cowers as his own soldiers drag him down from the throne. Some were exiled, some strangled with silken cords, their reigns ended not by foreign enemies but by the very corps sworn to protect them. This paradox lay at the heart of the empire's decline. The Janissaries were at once its shield and its greatest threat. Their loyalty was conditional, their obedience laced with menace. Every sultan knew, to rule the empire was to balance on a blade sharpened by his own army. Intrigue crept into every corner of their lives. In the barracks, factions formed. Some loyal to certain viziers, others to princes with claims to the throne, others to guilds and merchants whose fortunes rose or fell with policy. At night, in coffee houses thick with smoke, deals were struck, alliances formed. A promise whispered over a cup of bitter black coffee might one day topple a vizier, or decide which prince would emerge from the cage of Topkapi Palace to wear the crown. The Janissaries did not need to march to wield power. Their silence could sway politics. Their murmurs could unseat rulers. Imagine being a courtier in the palace, proposing a new law. Before your ink dries, you must ask yourself, what will the Janissaries say? Will they grumble in their barracks? Will they overturn kettles? Will they march? The shadow of their opinion loomed larger than any decree. But conspiracy was not only about politics. It was also about survival. Within the corps, men schemed for promotion, for favor, for wealth. Bribes flowed like water, patronage networks spread like roots. A man who rose through merit was respected. A man who rose through intrigue was feared. Both paths led to power, but only one required discipline. More and more, the corps favored the latter. And still, the Brotherhood cloaked it all. Outwardly, the Janissaries remained united. Their rituals continued, their prayers rose, their kettles boiled. But beneath the surface, factions coiled like snakes, striking in shadows. Conspiracies bloomed like mold in the cracks discipline had left behind. Imagine again the coffee house, a dim room, the lamps glowing, the smoke curling thick. A janissary leans close to a merchant, his voice low. He promises protection for a price, whispers of a vizier soon to fall, hints of changes at the palace. The merchant listens, nods, pays. Across the room, another group murmurs about a prince waiting in the wings, a sultan growing too indulgent, too weak. The seeds are planted. Tomorrow, the city may riot. Next week, a vizier may fall. Next month, a sultan may die. All begins in whispers, in smoke, in conspiracy. The core, once forged to obey without thought, had become an empire within the empire, a body that could topple governments as easily as it once stormed fortress walls. The same unity that had made them invincible on battlefields now made them terrifying in politics. No vizier, no sultan, no reformer could move against them without risking everything. And yet, this power corroded them from within. For intrigue thrives on suspicion, and suspicion gnaws at brotherhood. Though they still called each other brothers, trust thinned. Every word might be repeated, every plan betrayed. Loyalty was no longer only to the sultan, nor to the core, but to factions, to patrons, to hidden promises made in smoke. The Janissaries became not only soldiers, not only citizens, but conspirators at the heart of the Ottoman world. And the empire, vast and weary, carried their weight like a sickness it could neither cure nor survive without. The smoke of coffee houses lingers, but whispers cannot always remain whispers. There comes a point when murmurs swell into chants, when kettles overturn with a clang heard across the city, when boots march not toward foreign fortresses but toward the Sultan's own gates. The Janissaries, once the empire's silent weapon, learn that rebellion can roar louder than muskets. Imagine Istanbul on one of these days. The morning begins as always, merchants arranging wares in the bazaar, children darting between stalls, muezzins calling the faithful to prayer. Then, a sound cuts through the ordinary hum, drums, low and heavy, rolling like thunder. From the barracks pour the Janissaries, not in neat lines of parade, but in furious masses, sabers at their sides, muskets slung across their backs, banners whipping in the wind. The people scatter. Shops close their shutters. Mothers drag children into doorways. For all know what it means when the Janissaries march together in anger. They head for the palace, kettles overturned in their courtyards, the sign of mutiny. Smoke rises behind them as torches are flung into the homes of hated officials, as fires leap into the sky. Streets echo with their chants, demanding justice, demanding pay, demanding blood. The causes are many. Sometimes it is wages, arrears unpaid, donatives delayed. Sometimes it is reforms, whispers of discipline being restored, threats to their privileges. Sometimes it is a vizier who dared to cross them, a sultan who appeared too weak, a policy that threatened their grip on power. Whatever the spark, the fire always spreads the same way, fast, furious, unstoppable. Picture the palace gates as they approach. Guards waver, knowing that to raise arms against Janissaries is to invite certain death. The gates are forced open, the courtyards filled with soldiers who once swore loyalty. Viziers hide in corners, servants flee, the Sultan himself listens in dread as the roar of rebellion echoes through his halls. He knows that thrones have been toppled this way, that silk cords have been wrapped around royal necks at the Janissaries' demand. His rule, his very life, now hangs on whether he can appease them. And appeasement is always costly. Gold flows from the treasury to quiet them, viziers are sacrificed to their fury, reforms are abandoned, promises are made that cannot be kept. The core disperses, but not before blood stains the stones, not before smoke blackens the sky. The city remembers, and the palace trembles. These rebellions are not rare. They become the rhythm of the empire's decline, each generation marked by new uprisings. In 1622, they stormed the palace and murdered Sultan Osman II, a young ruler who dared to challenge their power, who dreamed of reforming the army by recruiting a new corps. Dragged from his chambers, strangled in the very barracks meant to serve him, Osman's death was a warning carved into the empire's heart. The Janissaries would not be tamed. Others followed. Viziers ambitious enough to attempt reform found themselves torn apart by mobs. Princes whispered of as possible heirs vanished mysteriously when Janissary factions decided which bloodline to favor. The Corps had learned that rebellion was not only protest but a tool, a weapon as effective as muskets, one that reshaped politics as surely as it toppled walls. For the people of Istanbul, rebellion was terror. Imagine a shopkeeper standing in his doorway as Janissaries rampaged through the streets, overturning stalls, looting warehouses, setting fires. His livelihood can vanish in an afternoon, his family caught in the chaos. To live in the city was to know that peace was fragile, that the core which claimed to protect the empire could at any moment turn into its destroyer. Yet fear is never one-sided. The Janissaries themselves feared betrayal, feared that the Sultan might secretly plot their destruction, feared that viziers schemed to replace them with new troops, feared that their privileges might slip away. Their rebellions were born of anger, yes, but also of paranoia. Each uprising was both attack and defense, both a show of strength and a desperate attempt to secure survival. And so rebellion became ritual, as much a part of their culture as prayer or drill. The overturned kettle, the march through the city, the demand for donatives. These were not spontaneous acts but rehearsed performances, known to all, feared by all. The empire endured them like storms, each one leaving scars, each one weakening the foundation of loyalty between throne and core. Still, in their brotherhood, rebellion felt righteous. Around kettles and smoke-filled barracks, they told stories of past uprisings with pride. They sang songs of viziers slain, of sultans humbled, of privileges won through fire. Rebellion was not betrayal in their eyes. It was tradition, a way of reminding the empire that they were not merely its servants but its masters. Yet every rebellion carried a price. The treasury drained to appease them, reforms halted before they began, rulers humiliated before their people. Slowly, the empire staggered beneath the weight of their demands. Neighbors who once trembled at Ottoman armies began to sense weakness, sensing that the empire's greatest soldiers had become its greatest liability. And still, the cycle continued. Whisper, grievance, uprising, appeasement. Smoke, blood, silence. Again and again, until rebellion was no longer shocking but expected. The empire lived at the mercy of its own army. Walk once more through Istanbul on such a day. The air is thick with smoke, the ground slick with blood, the sound of drums echoing like thunder. The Janissaries march, their faces hard, their eyes cold. Around them, the city burns, but within them, the Brotherhood holds strong. They are no longer shadows of the Sultan. They are storm itself, uncontrolled, unstoppable, feared by all, even by the throne they once swore to protect. The streets fall silent after rebellion. Smoke clears, bodies are buried, kettles are righted again in the barracks. Life resumes, but something is always left behind, a trace of weakness, a shadow of decay. The Janissaries who march back to their quarters are not the same men who once stormed Constantinople's walls or shattered the knights of Hungary. Their sabers gleam, their muskets still hang in rows, but the steel in their spirit has begun to bend. The decline does not come all at once. It seeps in slowly, like damp through stone. First, it is the grumbling in the ranks, the reluctance to march to distant campaigns. Then it is the clink of coins louder than the clatter of muskets, the lure of coffee houses stronger than the call of the drum. Soon, the barracks themselves seem quieter, less a forge of discipline, more a resting place for men whose hearts are elsewhere. Imagine a campaign announced. Once, the news would have filled the barracks with fierce anticipation, weapons sharpened, prayers whispered, boots prepared for the march. But now, discontent stirs first. Some demand higher pay before they will move. Others mutter that their shops will suffer, their families will go hungry in their absence. Some bribe their officers to be excused, others feign illness, others simply disappear into the city. The corps that once marched as one wall now limps in fragments. And on the battlefield, the change is stark. The wall of muskets, once drilled to terrifying precision, now falters. Volleys ring out unevenly, reloading is sluggish, lines break more easily. Enemies who once trembled at the sight of Janissary banners now stand firm, sensing hesitation. Defeats that once would have been unthinkable creep into the record, battles lost not from lack of numbers but from lack of discipline. The world itself changes around them. European armies modernize, adopting new tactics, new weapons, new organization. Muskets become rifles, volleys turn into flexible maneuvers, artillery grows more devastating. But the Janissaries cling to the old ways, their pride blinding them to change. Why should they adapt, they ask, when they have been invincible for centuries? But invincibility is a myth, and myths crack. Within Istanbul, the decline is even clearer. The corps swells with men who no longer train, no longer fight. Sons inherit their fathers' places, families guard Janissary privileges as property. The barracks fill not with hardened soldiers but with merchants, artisans, men who wear the uniform yet spend their days in markets. Their muskets gather dust in corners, their hands more skilled at coin counting than combat. And yet, their privileges remain. They still demand pay, still receive donatives, still expect respect. To the people of the city, the Janissary is no longer the shadow of war but a burden, a bully, a symbol of decline. They swagger through bazaars, extorting merchants, intimidating rivals, using their name not for the empire but for themselves. Fear remains, but it is a different kind of fear, not awe of their strength, but dread of their lawlessness. The Sultan watches, but his hands are tied. He knows they are weaker, less disciplined, more corrupt. He knows they no longer match the armies of Europe. Yet he also knows they can still march in rebellion, still overturn kettles, still storm his palace if provoked. To reform them is to risk destruction. And so he waits, hoping, fearing, watching as the corps rots from within. Imagine standing in the barracks now. Once alive with the thunder of drills, the sharp crack of muskets, the chants of prayer, it now hums with quieter sounds, dice rattling on boards, the murmur of business deals, the laughter of men lounging on mats. The kettles still boil, but the stew is rich now, flavored with spices bought from markets, far from the austere meals of old. The air smells less of sweat and gunpowder, more of tobacco and coffee. It is not the barracks of warriors anymore. It is the barracks of a guild, of a fraternity of privilege. And with privilege comes decay. The corps resists change, clings to tradition not out of discipline but out of fear of losing what little power remains. Reformist sultans and viziers propose new armies, new weapons, new tactics. The Janissaries resist, knowing that any reform will strip them of their place. Better to weaken the empire than to lose their privileges. And so, again and again, they rise in rebellion not to defend the empire, but to defend themselves. This is the cruel irony. The corps that once embodied the empire's strength becomes the weight that drags it down. Their rebellions weaken the throne, their refusal to modernize weakens the army, their corruption weakens society. The shadow that once protected the Sultan now darkens his reign. And yet, in their decline, they remain dangerous. Weakness does not make them harmless. It makes them unpredictable, desperate, clinging to power even as it slips through their fingers. A corps that can no longer defeat Europe can still terrorize its own city. And so Istanbul continues to live under their shadow, the people torn between resentment and fear. Walk again through the bazaar. A Janissary leans on the doorframe of a shop, demanding free bread, his saber tapping against the wood. The shopkeeper obeys, knowing refusal could bring ruin. Down the street, another collects rent from tenants, his uniform granting authority no magistrate would challenge. In the coffee house, others boast of battles fought long ago, their voices loud, their memories grander than the truth. These are not the warriors of old, but men living on the fumes of a legend, using its power to prop up their fading strength. And still, the empire suffers. Wars are lost, territories slip away, enemies grow bolder. The Janissaries remain at the center, a cord that once carried the empire on its shoulders but now drags it into decline. Their strength has not vanished, but it has transformed into something hollow, the echo of discipline, the ghost of loyalty, the shadow of fear. The decline is not a sudden fall, but a slow erosion. Stone by stone, the fortress crumbles, until what remains is only the shell of what once terrified the world. And as you stand in the barracks, watching men lounge where once they drilled, you feel it, the weight of history bending, the inevitability of collapse. The Janissaries are still here, still feared, still privileged. But the iron has rusted. The shadow has thinned. The end is approaching. The barracks are no longer what they once were. No longer a forge of discipline, no longer a monastery of soldiers, but a hive of unrest and privilege. The muskets lie dusty, the drills neglected, the coffee houses thick with smoke and conspiracy. And in the palace, Sultan Mahmud too watches. He knows what every sultan before him has known. The Janissaries are both his shield and his curse. But unlike those before him, he resolves not to appease. He resolves to end. Imagine the Sultan in his chambers at Topkapi. Outside, the Bosporus glitters in the sun, ships drifting lazily across its waters. Inside, tension coils like a drawn bowstring. For months, Mahmud has planned, whispering with loyal viziers, gathering allies, preparing in silence. He knows the danger. He knows the Janissaries will not surrender their privileges. He knows their brotherhood will not dissolve by decree. To destroy them, he must strike with absolute force, in one swift, merciless blow. The moment comes in June of 1826. Mahmud announces a new military reform, a corps to be trained in modern European tactics, armed with modern weapons. It is, in truth, a challenge, a dare cast like a gauntlet into the barracks. The Janissaries hear, and fury spreads like fire through dry grass. For centuries they have crushed every attempt at reform. They believe they will crush this one too. The barracks erupt. Drums thunder, kettles overturn, muskets are seized from racks. Once more they march, their boots striking the streets, their voices rising in angry chants. Citizens scatter, shops slammed shut, the city holds its breath. The Janissaries move toward the palace, as they always have, confident that once again they will force the Sultan's hand, demand the abandonment of reform, demand gold and blood. But this time is different. This time, Mahmud is ready. Imagine the palace gates, no longer trembling, but bristling with cannon. Loyal troops, trained in secret, stand ready. Artillery lines the walls, barrels aimed at the very barracks the Janissaries call home. As the rebels pour into the streets, Mahmud gives the order. The cannons roar. The sound splits the air, shaking the city to its bones. Fire rains down upon the Janissary barracks. Walls collapse, timbers shatter, men scream as stone and flame bury them. Muskets crack in reply, but they are nothing against the thunder of artillery. The very barracks that once sheltered their brotherhood become their tomb. Picture it, the chaos inside. Smoke choking the air, men scrambling for weapons, kettles overturned and trampled, brothers crushed beneath falling beams. For the first time, their unity falters. There is no order, no discipline, only panic. Some try to fight, others flee, but the cannons do not relent. The barracks are reduced to rubble, the core torn apart in fire and blood. Those who survive the bombardment pour into the streets, only to meet the Sultan's loyal troops. Muskets flash, sabers gleam, blood runs in the gutters. Janissaries who once terrified empires fall like ordinary men, their brotherhood shattered by the relentless fury of a ruler who will not be defied. The people of Istanbul watch from shuttered windows. For centuries they cowered before Janissary uprisings, but now they see the core destroyed before their eyes. Some whisper in fear, others cheer quietly, for the soldiers who once extorted them, bullied them, terrorized them, are finally broken. The streets that once trembled beneath Janissary boots now drink their blood. By nightfall, it is over. Thousands lie dead, in the rubble of the barracks, in the alleys of the city, in heaps outside the palace gates. Others are captured, dragged from hiding places, executed swiftly. Some are exiled, scattered to distant provinces, stripped of their uniforms, their privileges, their identity. The kettles are gone, overturned for the last time. The Brotherhood is no more. This moment is remembered as the auspicious incident. An ironic name, for it was a massacre, a purge not of enemies, but of the Sultan's own army. Yet to Mahmud, to the court, to the empire itself, it was auspicious indeed. For the first time in centuries, the throne was free of the shadow that had loomed over it. The Sultan ruled without fear of rebellion from his own guard. But the price of this freedom was steep. An army destroyed is not easily replaced. The empire, already weakened by centuries of decline, now faced its enemies without the core that had once been its pride. Mahmud's new army would take time to train, time the empire did not have. The Janissaries were gone, but their absence left scars that could not be healed. And yet, in the silence that followed, in the smoldering ruins of the barracks, one could feel a strange finality. The story of the Janissaries, which began with stolen boys and forged discipline, which rose in fire and fear, which twisted into privilege and rebellion, had ended in blood. The Brotherhood that once seemed eternal was mortal after all. Imagine walking through the ruins the next morning. Smoke still rises from blackened stones. Shattered kettles lie half buried in ash, twisted metal glinting in the dawn. Scorched banners hang in tatters, their emblems unrecognizable. Among the rubble, the bodies of men who once marched in perfect unison now lie broken, scattered, silent. The air smells of gunpowder, blood, and finality. The barracks that once rang with laughter, prayer, and rebellion are now only graveyards. For centuries, the Janissaries had been the empire's heart, and its disease, its shield, and its poison. They had risen higher than any core in history, shaping not only battlefields but thrones, not only wars but politics. And in the end, they fell not to foreign armies, not to enemies at the gates, but to their own Sultan, to the very throne they had once sworn to protect. The Brotherhood was broken, its secrets silenced, its rituals ended. No more would kettles boil in their courtyards. No more would drums thunder through the streets of rebellion. No more would the Sultan tremble at their whispers. The Janissaries were gone. The smoke has lifted. The screams have faded. In the ruins of the barracks, the silence is heavy, as though the stones themselves are trying to remember. The Janissaries are gone, butchered, exiled, erased. But can a brotherhood so deeply woven into the empire's soul ever truly vanish? Or do their shadows linger, whispering through the corridors of memory, haunting the very throne they once guarded? Walk the streets of Istanbul in the years after 1826. The fear of rebellion is gone, yet the emptiness is palpable. Citizens whisper of the auspicious incident with both relief and unease. Some celebrate that the bullies of the market, the extortionists of guilds, the storm of rebellion, have finally been silenced. Others mourn, not for individuals, but for the weight of history lost, the sense that something ancient, terrible, and powerful has been severed forever. The Sultan parades his new army, drilled in European fashion, clad in modern uniforms. They march in tidy lines, their muskets gleaming, their discipline fresh. But the people who watch them cannot help but compare. The Janissaries may have decayed, may have corrupted, may have rebelled, but they were still Janissaries, still bound by a brotherhood that no new corps could replace. The new soldiers are tools. The Janissaries had been legends. And that is their true legacy, not what they became, but what they once were. For centuries they embodied the very heart of the Ottoman war machine, boys torn from families, remade in discipline and faith, wielding muskets with a precision the world had never seen. They conquered Constantinople, stormed fortresses, broke armies, bent nations to the will of the Sultan. They were invincible not because they could not be defeated, but because they believed themselves incapable of it. Their aura of terror carried farther than their muskets' range. Yet alongside that strength lay their darker truth. They were not merely protectors but parasites, not only loyal but dangerous, not only disciplined but destructive. Their brotherhood, which gave them unity, also gave them the power to defy the very throne they swore to protect. Their privileges, meant to secure loyalty, became chains on the empire itself. Their rebellions weakened the state they were created to defend. Their decay mirrored the empire's decline. Their story is not one of simple rise and fall. It is a cycle of transformation, from stolen boys to disciplined soldiers, from disciplined soldiers to privileged elites, from privileged elites to rebels, from rebels to corpses beneath the Sultan's cannons. At each turn, they reflected the empire's condition, its ambition, its glory, its corruption, its desperation. To trace the story of the Janissaries is to trace the story of the Ottoman Empire itself. But there is another layer, one that makes their tale linger even after their destruction. It is the human layer, the dark secret of what they truly were. Imagine again that boy in a Balkan village, torn from his mother's arms, marched into the empire, stripped of his name, his faith, his past. Imagine him remade into a soldier who would never see home again, who would forget his language, who would kneel before a sultan he had never chosen. For centuries, tens of thousands lived this fate. Some became generals, viziers, men of power and privilege. Others died nameless in foreign fields. Behind the legend of the Janissaries lies the quiet, aching tragedy of stolen childhoods. And yet many of those boys grew to embrace their new identity, to wear the Janissary cap with pride, to find in the Brotherhood a family stronger than the one they had lost. They marched together, prayed together, rebelled together, died together. Their story is not only about power and corruption, but about resilience, the ability of human beings to adapt, to create belonging even in chains. Their rituals live on in memory. The kettles, the oaths, the drums, the songs whispered in barracks at night, all gone, yet not forgotten. Historians write of them, storytellers recount them, musicians echo their marching bands and performances even today. The shadow of the Janissaries has outlived their core. And what of the lesson? Perhaps it is this: loyalty that is absolute can become absolute danger. An army that answers only to the throne can, in time, control the throne. Privileges meant to buy obedience can purchase corruption. Discipline can decay into rebellion. No empire, no ruler, no institution is safe from the rot that grows when power is unchecked. The Janissaries remind us that strength and weakness can be one and the same, that the weapon a ruler trusts most can become the hand that strangles him. Imagine standing now in the ruins of their old barracks. Tourists pass, scholars take notes, children play where once soldiers trained. The stones whisper if you listen, the tramp of boots, the roar of muskets, the crash of rebellion, the thunder of cannon. The air still seems heavy with smoke and blood. You can almost hear the drums, the chants, the clash of steel. The Brotherhood is gone, but its ghost lingers, woven into the memory of the city, into the very stones of the empire they once upheld. And so, as our journey through their world comes to a close, we are left not only with their rise and fall, but with the haunting echo of their legacy. The Janissaries were more than soldiers. They were a mirror held up to power, a warning carved into history, a story of how loyalty, when twisted by privilege and fear, becomes the seed of destruction. Their dark secrets remain: the stolen children, the overturned kettles, the strangled sultans, the blood in the streets, the cannons at the barracks. But so too remains the fascination, the awe, the reminder of a brotherhood that once ruled not only with muskets but with silence, with ritual, with unity stronger than steel. The night settles now, the story rests. The Janissaries are gone, but their shadow stretches still. And perhaps, as you close your eyes, you can hear them marching, not in flesh, but in memory, a reminder of what once was, and of what power, discipline, and corruption can create.